If you care about real history and practical survival knowledge, not fantasy or hype, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts right now and, well, share this with someone who still thinks Cold War shelters are obsolete. Because what you're about to hear isn't nostalgia, it's instruction. During the Cold War, governments assumed cities would be hit first. Infrastructure would collapse instantly, and civilians would have to survive for weeks underground, with limited information and fewer supplies. Those assumptions were grim, but they produced some of the most disciplined, realistic urban survival strategies ever developed. Today's preppers can learn a great deal from them, especially those living in dense cities where escape is not guaranteed. Why Cold War fallout shelters were designed for cities, not wilderness fantasies. Cold War planners didn't imagine lone survivors in forests. They planned for apartment blocks, office towers, subways and basements packed with civilians. Fallout shelters were integrated into existing structures because evacuation timelines were measured in minutes, not days. That reality matters today. Most urban disasters, whether conflict, grid failure or civil breakdown, happen faster than people expect. The Cold War model teaches a simple lesson. Survival often begins where you already are. A modern urban prepper should identify 2 or 3 shelter-capable locations within walking distance, such as a reinforced basement underground parking structure or interior room below ground level. The key is mass and shielding, not secrecy. Concrete, earth and distance from external walls remain as effective now as they were in 1962. One of the least understood aspects of Cold War shelters is ventilation. Engineers knew that sealing people underground without airflow would kill them faster than radiation, so, they had to get creative. Manual air pumps, blast valves and filtered intake systems were standard. The principle was redundancy and simplicity. No reliance on grid power, no complex electronics. That's how fallout shelter ventilation systems solve the air problem, and honestly, why that still matters today. For modern application, this means preparing for breathable air in enclosed spaces during smoke events, chemical exposure, or prolonged sheltering. A practical step today is acquiring a manual ventilation fan, learning how to create a filtered intake using layered cloth and charcoal, and identifying how air naturally circulates in your building. Many Cold War shelters relied on stack effect, using temperature differences to move air, which, by the way, is still quite clever. That knowledge applies directly to apartment buildings and basements today. How rationing and water discipline kept civilians alive longer than expected. Cold War shelters were not stocked for comfort, they were stocked for endurance. Daily caloric intake was often cut to survival minimums, and water was strictly rationed. What made this effective was planning, not abundance. Food was chosen for shelf life, density and morale value. Crackers, hard candy, fortified biscuits and simple protein sources dominated storage lists. It's not glamorous, but it worked. For a modern prepper, the lesson is to practice rationing before you need it. Measure how much water your household actually consumes when usage is restricted. Store foods that can be eaten without cooking and rotate them regularly. Even more important, store containers suitable for sanitation. Cold War planners understood that disease would kill more people than hunger if waste wasn't managed properly in confined spaces. Why shelter discipline and routines mattered as much as physical supplies. Historical records from shelter drills show that order was enforced deliberately. Lighting schedules, cleaning rotations, watch shifts, and quiet hours were established quickly. This wasn't about control for its own sake. It was about preventing panic and conserving energy. In a modern context, anyone sheltering with family or neighbours should establish roles early. Decide who monitors external information, who manages supplies, and who maintains cleanliness. Cold War manuals emphasized routine because boredom and fear degrade judgment. This insight applies equally to extended blackouts, curfews, or lockdowns in urban environments. So, let's talk about how Cold War civil defense intelligence can guide modern threat assessment. Back then, citizens were actually trained to recognize fallout patterns, blast zones, and those all-important warning signs. They learned that survival odds varied, sometimes drastically, based on distance, shielding, and timing. And honestly, modern survivalists really benefit from that same analytical mindset. It pays to learn your city's infrastructure. You should know where power substations, water treatment plants, and transit hubs are located. Now, how do you retrofit Cold War shelter principles into modern apartments and offices? Well, you don't need a bunker, believe it or not. Cold War logic always favoured adaptation. Interior bathrooms, stairwells and storage rooms were commonly designated as shelter areas. These days, you can reinforce an interior room with dense materials like books, water containers and furniture to increase the mass between you and external threats. It's really worth identifying how to block windows quickly, reduce light leakage, and maintain thermal stability. So, why is Cold War shelter thinking still relevant in our, fragile urban world? The Cold War produced a generation that understood systems failure as normal, not exceptional. Power loss, communication breakdown, and delayed aid were all expected conditions. That mindset is honestly invaluable today. Urban survival isn't about running away at the first sign of trouble. It's about enduring intelligently until conditions stabilize. You know, fallout shelters were never meant to be permanent homes. They were bridges between chaos and recovery. And that remains the most realistic goal for modern preparedness. If this kind of deep historical survival knowledge matters to you, do subscribe to Iron Age Instincts, share this with a fellow history buff or prepper, and, keep these lessons alive. The past still has a lot to teach those willing to study it seriously.